bees. The overview for today is going to be what is a swarm, what is a superorganism, who are the bees, and then how to catch them. I won't focus too much on bee anatomy and biology that you can learn in some of my other classes, but I will go over what a swarm is and what the bees are doing just to give you a sense of reference. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it is swarm season, so welcome to swarm season. I've been catching swarms since February this year. I've been catching swarms in my life for 10 years, and my beekeeping journey began with a wild swarm moving into the wall behind my house, just behind my bed. I got to live with those bees living on the wall of my house for a year, and then that following spring, I caught a swarm, and you'll see a photo of that swarm later on in the presentation. So why do we start with this word superorganism? Borrowed definition from the dictionary. The term superorganism is used most often to describe a social unit of eusocial animals, where division of labor is highly specialized and where individuals are not able to survive by themselves for extended periods. And so the best known example of such organisms so are honeybees, mushrooms, aspen trees. So a honeybee colony is made up of a number of individuals, predominantly maidens, what most people call worker bees or female bees. They're the drones, which are the male bees. So they're often sisters and brothers or half-sisters, stepsisters, stepbrothers. They're often related. And the queen. Typically, there's only one queen in the hive, although there is always an exception to the rule. And I have absolutely found multiple queens in a hive more than once. Multiple queens in a hive often happen around this time of year when bees are getting ready to swarm. Bees living inside a colony or inside a hive are called a colony. And when they swarm, they divide as a colony. In fact, that division and self-recreation and becoming an entirely new colony, meaning that the old mother colony is left behind full and intact with a new queen and the new colony is beginning. This was so revered in the home of Apis mellifera in Central and Old Europe, particularly in the golden age of the bee culture in Europe, in Greece. This was so revered that it was equated with the goddess being able to give birth to herself in something called parthenogenesis or virgin birth. So bees were often associated with this ability to create from oneself. So what happens when bees reproduce? As a whole, when the colony, when the superorganism reproduces, they swarm. This is not the kind of swarm that you think about when someone says, oh, I was swarmed by bees, where you're waving around, running around, all that kind of mumbo jumbo. This is a reproductive swarm. The bees are actually in a very calm and often quite euphoric, beautiful state. It's a powerful experience to be around. Almost everything I say today has an exception to the rule, but typically swarming occurs, reproductive swarming occurs in the spring when a nectar flow happens. A nectar flow means something is blooming and it's blooming big. It's happening, like when blackberry blossoms go in June and July in the Northern Hemisphere and there's so much food. So there's spring nectar flow happens when, for instance, some of the apple blossoms start to bloom in this area. I'm in Sebastopol, Northern California. That would be a spring nectar flow. And the bees are returning with a lot of nectar. They can start a new life. So what happens is the bees start to signal this, they start to build, they put the queen on a diet and they start to build swarm cells, which are elongated queen cells where young queens are being raised, baby queens are being raised. Swarming as a whole is, as I've said, how the colony reproduces itself. And it's something I highly recommend trying to be around if you ever get the chance. So again, what happens when the bees swarm? When they're ready, they usually build a number of queen cells. I've seen up to 10 queen cells in a colony. They're often called swarm cells. In conventional beekeeping and a lot of beekeeping classes, people are taught to destroy those cells, to prevent swarming, and to kill those virgin queens when they see them. This comes from the idea that we need to suppress swarms, that we need to suppress the energy of birth, that we need to suppress the reproductive nature of the bees in order to keep as much of the workforce who makes honey for humans in the human profit-oriented mindset, keep that workforce at home, keep them in your hive. Because when a colony reproduces, a large number of bees leave the colony. As you see here, the queen mother, the mother of the hive, leaves with 2/3 to 3/4 of the workforce, meaning that the bees left behind are going to be smaller in number and take more time to build their numbers back up. We'll get back to what happens when they swarm, but I always encourage swarming. And if you're not going to allow for swarming, then actually making splits when the bees are ready to swarm, which is a whole different topic, but it's basically an artificial swarm where you're allowing the bees to reproduce by splitting them into 2 colonies manually. All right, so they make these queen cells that are hanging off the edge of the comb. The bees also put the queen on a diet so that she can fly, because often she's too heavy to fly without doing this. And sometimes they'll do these pre-swarm flights where the bees start to leave the hive in these swirling clouds and don't fully commit to that full swarming, that full beginning, but they'll leave and maybe they'll cluster in a small group on a branch for a few hours and go back into the hive, or even up to a full day and then go back into the hive. So that isn't always the case, but sometimes you'll see this pre-swarming. Often people will think that a swarm collected on the front of a hive is ready to go, is a swarm ready to be taken, but that's not always the case. So if you ever see a swarm on the front of your hive, wait a little while, watch them, see what they're doing. They may just be in that pre-swarm state and not quite ready to fully commit. And if you catch them and take them somewhere nearby, they're going to fly right back to that hive, or they're going to abandon the home that you give them because they're not ready. Bees will typically swarm on a warm spring day around 65 to 70 degrees, or in a break between rainy periods or cloudy periods. It's very often on a day after it rains. So typically you're going to find a swarm happening around 10, 11, 12 in the morning. That's standard. This season we've had a lot of really cold in California, cold mornings, followed by a afternoon break in the sun where the sun comes out and it's really warm and it heats up and it goes from being in the high 50s to suddenly being in the high 60s or mid 60s. And I've had a lot of afternoon swarms this year as a result, because the bees are waiting for that kind of safe moment when the sun is out. Bees don't typically like to be rained on, but all the time in the spring they do get rained on after they swarm, after they cluster. As I said before, the queen mother, so the mother of the colony, leaves with 2/3, 3/4 of the bees, of her daughters and some sons. And the bees will have consumed enough honey to live off for 3 or 4 days without a home. So once they leave their colony, and there's so much more I could get into around this, it's such a beautiful process, but long story short, once they leave, they're in what you could call a in-between or disembodied state. They are unincorporating and reincorporating. They're incredibly delicate and new and forming. And they take a little while to form and to become a being. They have this unity. They're loyal to this mother. They're loyal to each other, but they're still in this in-between state. And it's actually something you can really feel if you ever get to be around a swarm when they're in flight. A lot of people think of a swarm in flight as kind of a mass of bees moving, but often it's much more of a big, big cloud, this clouding out that happens. Part of the reason, although we only know part of the reason, anytime someone says a blanket statement about bees, we don't totally understand. We're still learning about them. So part of the reason why this cloud is happening, where there's just bees very, very big, high up in the air and all over the place, and they're landing on leaves, and they're landing on you, and they're landing on top of the hive, and they're landing in branches, and they're taking off again. That's to cause, not just to have this expansive, exuberant coming out, but also to veil the queen as she flies through so that she can land on a nearby branch, post, tree, in a bush, and be hidden and protected by that movement. So the queen will perch somewhere and the bees will cluster around her. A lot of people think that the queen is always just in the center of a swarm and all the bees are around her and protecting her. And yes, they do protect her and keep her warm because a drop in temperature and too much cold air can actually make her sterile. So they keep her warm, they protect her. But I was just recently talking to a friend who was watching a swarm, and the queen was out there walking around the outside edge of the swarm. So she's unpredictable too. From this point, scout bees, once they've all coalesced and come down and landed on a branch, scout bees, sister bees, female bees, will go out on journeys looking for a home. And they will return to the swarm and they will actually quite literally dance on the swarm in this vibrating figure 8 dance that communicates in relationship to the sun and relationship to the dance communicates all sorts of things like direction, how what the home might smell like, how good it is, all these types of things. And the more exuberant the dance, it's thought that perhaps that means the better home this could be. She'll bring some sisters back with her, one of these dancers, and they'll go check out the potential home and they'll come back and perform the dance. And meanwhile, on the other side of the swarm, another sister's found a home over there. Oh, maybe she's found a compost bin. Maybe this one's found a barn. Maybe this one's found a hollow in a tree. Because bees live in human habitat. And so they're looking for anything. They're looking for a warm, dry place, a warm, dark, dry place. And that's where the beekeeper comes in. If there were beautiful oak trees all over the place, or depending on where you live, I just love oak trees because I live around them, filled with lots of habitat for bees, it wouldn't be a concern. But bees often swarm in residential areas, in cities, in farmland where there is not a lot of food. And they will look for a home. And if they can't find a really beautiful home, like a tree, a hollow in a tree, they will move into places like your barn, the wall behind your house, or in your house, compost bins, garden sheds. Gosh, so many places. If you want to look up some really interesting bee removal situations, check out Hillary Kearney's work. Girl Next Door Honey is her Instagram. She's a wonderful resource. Eventually, the bees are going to vote to unanimously decide on their new home, and then they're going to start to release from the top or from the parts of the swarm that are actually holding onto the branch of the tree, and they'll start to cloud back out and become this big whirling buzz. In fact, you'll even sometimes hear this little piping or piping noise. I've just learned this from one of my favorite bee people over at Apis Arboreal, Mikhail Thiel. You can check out his work there. So the bees will start to make these little calling sounds, and then all at once they'll take off. And sometimes they'll fly directly to the home. And sometimes they'll fly partway there, coalesce on a branch again, stay there for maybe a half an hour, and then off they go, maybe a few minutes, then off they go. So if you're a beekeeper and you're catching bees and you find a swarm, you go to get your box and you come back and 20 minutes later they're gone, maybe they're in part of that in-between journey, or maybe they've just found a home and they've just left. Sometimes though, bees can stay looking for a home for 3, 4, 5 days, and then if they don't find one, they'll just have to start building comb right then and there. So I want to give you some examples of what swarms look like, so you can start to see some variations in swarms, because swarm catches are all unique. Beyond that, each swarm, aside from the formation they're in, is a unique personality. As a rule, swarms are fairly docile until they're not. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes They've been bothered in the night. Sometimes they've been out for 4 days and it's been really cold and wet and rainy and they're cranky and hangry. So usually a swarm is a very, very gentle experience, and it's one of my favorite ways to introduce people to bees. But sometimes you always do want to take precautions and start to learn what it's like to be around them and read the swarms so you don't get any surprises. So we're going to go through some photos of swarms now that we've talked about the process. If you really want to go into that voting process and how bees decide where to live, I would highly recommend any YouTube talks or books by Tom Seeley, who studies bees in the wild and wrote the book Honeybee Democracy, which is about the swarming and decision-making process. The last thing I'll say is, I've already touched on it a tiny bit, but a lot of people think when bees leave in a swarm that they're abandoning the colony. In the spring, that's not the case. Sometimes a fall swarm leaving is a swarm leaving because there's too much disease or too much of a problem inside the hive. But a reproductive swarm is never going to leave the colony that it was in empty. That colony is going to be filled with a new virgin queen that's about to hatch. In fact, multiple virgin queens. And those queens are going to hatch and start, and one of them will become queen, and that queen will often go to battle or kill the other queens in their cells, and then eventually go on her mating flight and start a daughter colony in that original home. I say that before I show some of these photos because you're going to see different sizes of swarms. And often the way to sort of perceive swarms is that there are that original mother swarm, that first early spring swarm, which can be very big. This is actually a very, very large swarm that you're seeing in this photo here. But then there can be secondary swarms. So we think of swarms as, well, that first swarm that's got a mated queen, she's a mother, she'll just set up shop, she'll start laying right away, they'll build right away. Not always the case. Sometimes there are secondary swarms. In fact, sometimes 2, 3, 4 swarms will come out of the same hive in a matter of days. Those second, third, fourth colonies, those swarms, may not be as strong because they do have a virgin queen. They have a young queen who is not yet tested, still needs to go on her virgin flight, still needs to make it through that experience of going out into the world and back. And anything can happen to her in that process. So sometimes the smaller swarms with the virgin queens are great, and sometimes they don't make it, which I've had both experiences this season, in fact. So here are 2 swarms. They will both have queens. In fact, some swarms have multiple queens even in that very swarm. They'll have the mother queen and maybe a daughter has already been born and she's in there. In this situation, I might combine these 2 swarms, or I might try to hive them separately. Hiving a swarm is meaning putting a swarm into a hive. We'll get to that. Here's the first swarm I ever caught in the shape of a beautiful heart. This swarm probably saved my life. That's a different story, but they taught me so much. Here's another example of a swarm on a post. So swarms aren't always in these nice little droopy configurations like you see here. This would be a pretty easy swarm catch, and in fact it was, because I could just shake or clip it into a box. We're going to get to that. But sometimes they're against a tree or a post, and that shaking method, I'm not going to do too well trying to shake that whole tree into that whole tree. It's an apple tree. Same here. Couldn't shake it. Had to invite the bees into a box a different way. And same with a post. Bees will sometimes swarm onto a post. Interestingly enough, bees will often swarm onto the same post or into the same tree year after year after year after year. And it can sometimes be from different colonies, because some of it has to do with scent, some of it has to do with memory. But I've seen garden posts in Sonoma County that fence posts have had multiple swarms. So here's a swarm up and down a post gathered, very different than a clump. Here is a smaller swarm. This would be a secondary swarm that you see here that this woman is holding. And they're not as big. They aren't that original big, huge cluster, that huge mother colony. So this swarm, easy to clip, we'll talk about clipping swarms, it's a perfectly viable swarm, but it's just a little bit smaller. And it isn't that perfectly droopy form. It's not included in my slides, but in fact, one of the ways you can catch a swarm is if you're able to clip it like this and it stays in one formation and it's small enough, you can literally clip and walk a swarm across a property to a hive. You don't have to necessarily bring the hive to the swarm if you have extra hives in your apiary. Again, here you see two swarms. It's all part of the same cluster, the same swarm, but they're just coming into being. So they haven't coalesced completely yet. Here you have the same thing, two swarms, but it's really all part of one swarm. There might be two virgin queens. I know for a fact that this is I believe that this is a secondary swarm actually. So again, there might be virgin queens in there. These are small swarms. So I would combine these two swarms into one hive so that there's enough bees to really raise a strong colony, and they'll select their queen. Here you see what was 7 clusters from an original mother swarm, and it's a bit fuzzy because many bees are still in flight. You might not be able to see it, but there's bees flying all over the place. They have gathered onto all of these branches of this oak tree and it started to cluster. Eventually, after this first initial clustering, they coalesced into one big swarm. Which is the first swarm picture you saw. We can go back to it actually right here. So this is that coalesced big swarm right there. That's all of those bees came into one big swarm. So this is just to give you an idea of the various kinds of swarms you might find out there. This swarm is inside the branches, the trunk or the tree branches open out and grow out. So a droopy kind of form, but still all intermingled with the tree branches. Here's another giant swarm. So swarms aren't always this kind of little size. This is kind of a typical swarm, I'd expect. This is a giant swarm. This was a big deal to catch. There's pictures of me touching swarms. Touching swarms is a really beautiful way to connect with a swarm. I don't recommend it for your first go round. It's one of the ways I start to work with bees, and it's actually how I scoop swarms, which we'll get to. But I wouldn't just go around sticking your hands in a swarm of bees until you start to learn what it is to be around bees in general and start to read their behavior. Okay, and I'm going to take a look at some of those questions at the end. Thank you. So, catching a swarm of bees. Let's start with what you need. Basic tools. I want to empower you to be able to catch a swarm of bees if you aren't an established beekeeper, if you aren't someone who has lots of equipment. So, basic tools, an office paper box. That's my swarm box. I have used variations of cardboard boxes for catching swarms for a decade. It works. It's great. It's not really aesthetic. It's not high tech. There are so many other more perhaps beekeepery ways to do it, where you have a specific swarm catch box that already has frames in it, or you have a nucleus colony waiting to put bees in it, or you have something called a swarm trap, which is a different conversation. But a swarm trap is where you set up a hive in an apiary, an empty space, a smaller box in an apiary, usually up in a tree, and hoping that bees swarm into it. So a mini box that you then take, and that would be like a wooden box, not a cardboard box. So my temporary bee catch is a cardboard box, like you see here. There have also been ways that people have caught swarms in nets. I'm not going to get into that, but that is one method. And I use a cardboard box, and that's what I'm going to teach you because I think it's super, super effective and easy as long as the swarm isn't gigantic. So your classic cardboard office box works, like the kind you'd use for school supplies or something like that. I say that because I have teachers in the family. That's a great box size for typical swarm, but sometimes you need a much larger box. So just be aware of that. We'll get into what that looks like. You need tape. I like duct tape. You'll need to have a hole cut out in the box, which is why I actually like office supply boxes, because they have those holes in the handles. And when you're taping your box back up, which we'll get to in the evening, you want to make sure that there's either like a piece of paper or something in front of that hole so that you're not actually taping sticky tape over bees themselves and then their wings and legs get stuck to it. So please don't do that. You're going to need garden clippers, perhaps. Maybe a little saw if you're going to end up sawing a branch. Can happen, does happen sometimes. Have access to a ladder if you're the type who feels intrepid enough to go up a ladder to catch a swarm. And maybe your smoker. I don't smoke swarms, but I do use my smoker for something else. We'll talk about that too. So what happens? How do you get a swarm call? You've got some equipment ready. You've got these things. I didn't mention in the equipment, I should, but please have protective clothing and gear. Please have gloves. Please have a veil. Please have everything ready to be able to catch a swarm. Swarms can be unpredictable. I have gotten very stung by swarms. Usually I don't. Usually I don't even need gear, but it can happen. So, okay, you want to catch a swarm, it's spring, but what do you do? How do you even go about finding a swarm? Who do you go to? What do you go to? There are a few different resources. One is to get on a swarm call line. It's like a emergency call line or a phone tree. And the way to get onto a swarm call line is usually through connections at your local beekeepers association. Some places ask for you to pay a fee to get on the swarm call list. Some people don't. Different beekeeping associations have different rules. Beyond that, if you can't get on the swarm call line, you can start to connect with people at your local beekeepers association. Go to the meetings, introduce yourself, start to make friends with other beekeepers. Sometimes other beekeepers will give you a swarm, or sometimes they'll be open to you coming on a swarm call when they get a swarm call, or sometimes they're willing to call you if they don't have the time to catch a swarm, so you could be a backup. Those are some of the ways. If you're on a swarm call line, you're gonna have to answer your phone when you get an anonymous number call. So, well, not anonymous, but just a number you don't recognize in your phone. That's because if they call you and you don't pick up or you don't call right back, they're going to call the next person in line. It's a first come, first serve. Whoever answers first as they go down the line. And then usually if you miss that call, you'll go back on the list and the next swarm that comes in will get the call. You'll get that call. So that's how that works. My favorite way to get swarms is honestly through family, friends, and social media. It's how it's always worked for me. I've been on many swarm call lists. I've gotten 2 swarms from swarm call lists. Over the years, all of my other swarms have come through word of mouth. Even when I was a brand new beekeeper and people hardly knew I was doing it. My first swarm call was, I put it out on social media. Hey, Nevada City, which is where I lived, I'm looking for a swarm. And lo and behold, I got a call. So that's a really great way. Just keep putting it out there, keep letting people know. Another thing people sometimes do is they'll put little flyers up, especially in the neighborhood, letting people know, here, this is what a swarm looks like. It's when the bees reproduce. The bees are very docile. I'm available to catch a swarm if you see one. And then through chance encounters with the divine. By chance encounters, I mean, my favorite way to catch a swarm or get a swarm call is to start to tap into this idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the bees are a highly intelligent being, and that you are interwoven and interconnected with the intelligence of the living earth because you're part of it. And that as you put your attention and your love and your longing towards connecting with bees and providing a home for them, perhaps a swarm might also reach out to you. And perhaps you might just get that feeling one day to go to that one park and you follow that impulse and there's a swarm As an example, I caught a huge swarm for someone once and I gave it to them. I really wanted the swarm, but I knew it wasn't mine and it was supposed to go to this other woman. It happened to be my birthday. And I was walking through downtown Nevada City thinking, I would love to catch a swarm, one for me. I have this empty hive and I'd really like to catch a swarm. And I had this sudden feeling to just turn down a street I never take. And I turned down the street walking home and I heard it there hidden in the bushes. And I stopped and I looked and there was a swarm waiting right there just after I'd had that thought. I can't tell you how many variations of that story I've heard over the years. Swarms do come to people. They really do. So start to put that little prayer out there that there's a swarm waiting for you and listen to that impulse and answer your phone when someone calls. All right. You know how I just talked about that swarm that I caught for someone? That's the swarm right here in a hawthorn tree. This is the largest swarm I've ever seen in my life and ever caught. It took a box about as tall as me. I am 5'7", and I got really stung in the process. It was a big swarm. I was fine. I just got stung through my pants, but I don't really react to bee stings. If you aren't sure, be very careful, please. And maybe don't catch a swarm this large, but this was a beauty. This swarm, I believe, was an entire colony after that swarmed after their home got destroyed just a quarter mile away when a bunch of pine trees were cut down. So they're not always this big, but this can happen. That swarm is as big as like it's like that's probably about from bottom to top, probably about 4.5 feet. The reason I show this picture is swarm calls are great, but is it a swarm you can actually collect? What do you need to know? What do you need to ask before you rush off to go drop everything and catch a swarm? So first and foremost, is it a swarm or a colony of bees? A lot of people call without knowing what they're actually looking at. So a swarm is a cluster of bees, generally outside or all amassed together, hanging on either a tree branch or against a post or something like that. You've seen lots of pictures now. A colony of bees is inside something generally, and they're coming and going. So just ask them to describe what it looks like, and you can usually deduce whether or not it's a colony of bees that's moved into a mailbox or a dresser or the side of a house, or it's actually a swarm of bees. Size of swarm is important. You know, if someone's sitting there going, oh, well, you know, it's like this tiny cluster of bees, it's probably the size of a baseball. That's not really going to be a viable swarm. Good reference points are sports balls. So soccer, basketball, those types of volleyball. A typical swarm, people will say, is about the size of a basketball. So that's often what I'll say. Is it bigger or smaller than a basketball? You know, the whole breadbasket thing. So find out the size of the swarm and have them kind of estimate how big it is. Other references are body parts. You could say, well, is it taller than your forearm? You know, that kind of thing. Give yourself a sense of reference. Location of the swarm, this is in two parts. First, is it on public property? Is it in a park? Is it on someone's home? Is it on the back of an office building? This kind of thing. And this is because then you need to check and see, do you have permission to catch it? Generally, you have permission to catch bees. People love you to take bees off of their property. And if you're asking for permission from a homeowner, making sure that you have permission to not just to catch the swarm, but to keep it, to take it away. Because sometimes they'll be like, oh, I want you to catch it, but I want to keep the bees. So make sure that you can actually take the bees. And then where is the swarm on the piece of property? Is it up in a tree? Is it low down to the ground? Ask how high it is. Generally, if it's higher than 10 feet, you're going to have an issue. You're definitely going to need a ladder. So I don't usually catch bees or even try to catch bees when somebody's like, oh, it's like 20 feet up in a tree. I'm not going to go for that. I'm going to let the bees go and be wild, and hopefully they'll find a suitable home for themselves. That's my take. How complicated does it look to get that swarm? And then also, are they like crawling into a space? Are they already kind of enmeshed deep inside something where they're in between arrival into a new home and swarm? So it's just really good to get a full description of that location. And how long have they been there? Big one. Oh, we just noticed it this morning. They weren't there this morning and now they're there. Like, oh, I think they've been there for a number of days. I mean, it rained and then they were still there. Really important to know. A fresh new swarm is going to have a very different energy signature than a swarm that's been out in the rain for a few days. A swarm that's been out in the rain for a few days might be angry. They might also be really on the edge, like they need a home right now, and they will be so relieved to find a home through you. Remember that they're looking for a warm, dry, dark space that has a pretty decent sized volume, but not so big, not so big. Often people think of beehives when they think of Langstroth square boxes, 2 or 3 or 4 big. You would never want to start a colony in a hive that big. They actually want a smaller cavity. Think about cavities in trees. That being said, all the time I've found massive and seen beautiful pictures of massive colonies inside the walls of houses, which are so well insulated. But in general, you want to start your colony in something that's snug enough for them to not have to warm a huge area of space, because in order to raise babies, which is a brood, they need heat and humidity that they have to generate themselves through consumption of nectar, which is their food source, or honey. So they need enough of a small enough space or a big enough space to do that. This huge swarm wouldn't. This swarm I could never put in a top bar hive. This swarm I could never put in just one box of a Langstroth hive. It would need multiple boxes right away. Here we are again with my basic tool, my cardboard box. You'll see another example of that. Where are we? Time? Great. Okay. As I said already, bees are typically docile in a swarm. They are a new being coming into form. They're looking for a home. So you'll have to tell all of this to a property owner, especially if they're nervous about bees. You're also going to need to tell them that most likely you're going to catch the swarm in the daytime and then come back at dusk. That is a really important piece in terms of swarm etiquette. You want to make sure that you're collecting as many bees as possible and not just collecting the bees at 10 in the morning once they've clustered and leaving, because there's going to be all those scouts that come back, and you could easily get a phone call again from someone saying, well, there's a bunch more bees on the branch. That's because you didn't get them all. By evening, all the bees will have gone into the box that you've poured them into, or the hive that you've provided, and then you can move the bees in the afternoon, early evening. You can't, that's not always the case. Sometimes a property manager needs you to just get them and go, in which case you are losing some of those bees that are out in the field looking for a home. So just be aware of that aspect of respect for the colony and the etiquette of the swarm. Ask the property owner if they're on like a rose bush or if they're on a small branch, if you can clip with garden shears or with clippers that branch, or if you can saw that branch. Often the answer is yes, but sometimes it's no. So just be aware of that, because it's one of the easiest ways to collect a swarm that's on a branch, a thin branch. And also if they have dogs, especially kind of small yappy dogs, honestly, I would ask them to keep their dogs indoors while you're doing the swarm catch, because they can sometimes irritate bees. A few more pointers on swarm etiquette. Swarms are the best way to get bees. Bees are hormonally prepared to swarm, to start a new colony. They know they're doing that. They've decided to do that together. They aren't shaken bees that have been shaken into a package and sold with a queen that's not their mother. They're really prepared for this. And it's a lot of beekeepers only want to get swarms, and especially in the natural beekeeping community. But there is an etiquette to it. So if you come across a colony, you got to know whose bees they are. If you're just take a look at the property where you see them, are there other hives there? If there are other hives there, then there's a beekeeper there who may want to be informed that their bees have swarmed. If you're in a park, it's good to have a friend around. Either maybe you can have somebody come over and stay while you go get your equipment, because it's kind of a first come, first served thing. And so either leaving a sign saying that there's a bee removal in process, or leaving a friend there to kind of keep an eye on the swarm. Because it does happen that you see a swarm, you go to get your stuff and you come back and somebody else has set up shop and is already collecting them. Please don't ever go onto somebody's property or clip branches from their property without asking permission. And never ever take bees from a swarm catch already in process. And now we're on to methods for catching a swarm. First things first, you will either need a box or a hive. So cardboard box, my trustworthy method, or an actual hive. It can be a full hive, whether that's a top bar hive, a wary hive, a Langstroth hive, or any other alternative hive, or it can be a mini hive, like a nucleus-sized colony, a little one, depending on the swarm size. You can drop those bees directly into a hive, it's the hive itself, or into an intermediary cardboard box that you will then take to a hive and pour into the hive. Next, you'll need to assess how to get the bees into the box or the hive. And so from now on, when I say box, I mean both box and or beehive, empty beehive. Here are some of the methods. You can leave the box by the swarm, close to it, on the ground near it, on a ladder, on a chair near it, as an invitation to see if the bees go into it themselves. You can shake the bees into the box, which is the most common method you'll see online. You can clip a branch and just lower them into the box if they're small enough. You can set up a route for the bees to walk into the box. And you can scoop the bees. Every swarm catch is different. Every swarm catch is an adventure. There are other things people have done that aren't listed here, but these are just some of the basic methods. So one of the easiest things is to set up a hive as an invitation for the bees. This is one of those office boxes I talked about with a nice little hole already cut out for the bees. In this case, I put the box right below the swarm. I set up a couple of bricks. I put the box on a chair. You can see that's a brick that the bees are using as a bridge because bees won't fly into the box as much as walk into it. They like to walk and to bridge, which you can see them hanging on to each other as they bridge across and walk across this little bridge into the box. So this becomes an invitation to them to come into the box. You can also create little ramps for them into the box, any kind of bridge into the home. You can take a little handful of bees and show them the entrance, and then they can walk off your hands into the box and discover it on their own. It's really beautiful to watch. Here's another example. This is that birthday swarm that I found in a maple tree. They were covering the interior of this maple tree, and I just set the box inside the tree itself, and the bees filled the box, and I came back in the evening and gathered it up. That's the easiest. Next is clipping a branch, if it's at all possible. And yeah, I do see the questions. I'm just gonna answer them towards the end. Okay, I will actually answer that question right now. Do I place anything in the box to entice them? If the box is a bee hive, I will, sometimes I'll put a drop of lemongrass oil in the hive before I bring it over to the swarm, or earlier in the week perhaps, or just the season. Sometimes having the bar, if it's a hive that's been used before and the bars or the frames have residual wax on them, that's scent enough. You can put, I often use propolis, or I'll rub propolis on the walls of a box, but it's not really necessary in that first catch. It's the box that you're gonna hive them in permanently, their home, that's the one you really want it to smell like a home for them to decide to stay. So this bee, it's hard to see, I'm going to give you another picture of it, but here's a swarm, a small secondary swarm that's just hanging from a branch. And I just clipped the branch, being careful not to jostle the bees so they don't fall off of each other. I actually set up a sheet underneath so that I could rescue fallen bees and make sure I could see them so I didn't step on them. And then I just lowered that branch right into the box, as you can see here. You can see that I've also taped up the other side entrance, so there's only one entrance that they're coming and going from. Then I immediately put the lid on as much as possible to create a dark space for them, so that they're really only using 1 or 2 spots to enter into the box. Here's another example. This is shaking a swarm and inviting the swarm into the box. So I jerry-rigged a ladder in a high branch. Oh,
Yeah.
someone just came in. If you wouldn't mind muting. For some reason, I'm having trouble. Okay, I'll just do it myself.
Oh, what just happened? Where'd it go?
Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, back to this presentation. So here's a beehive and a high swarm, a hive and a swarm in a high tree I couldn't reach. It was too far in and too high up. So what I did was I set up a ladder, and I got just the tiniest bit of the clump into the box. I reached out and I got a little bit of the clump into the box by shaking a branch, and they fell in a little bit. And then I just set the box on top of the ladder. I actually used straps to strap it down so it didn't fall. And you can see that it's left open just a little bit right there. There's a crack. I did that at first until enough bees were in there that I could close the lid, and then just waited. And later came back in the afternoon and the bees had all entered into the box. So that's another way is to kind of do it half and half, where you're showing them the box and then they decide to go in on their own. Here's another example of going up pretty high in a ladder to clip a swarm and then shake as much of the swarm into the box. One of the things about shaking a swarm is that you really do have to have the box or the hive right under the swarm, and you have to give it a really good jostle, because what you're doing is you're getting the bees to let go of the clump that they're on. And when they let go of the branch and they fall as a clump, they fall as a clump into the box, hopefully not all over you, although that's happened to me too, into the box. And then they start to crawl up the sides of the wall and fan a little bit, and you can get the lid down on the box, and the bees remaining on the branch will eventually find their way down. Sometimes all the bees leave and go back to the branch and do it again. If this happens repeatedly, you may not be able to catch that swarm. They may have already decided on a different home that they want to go to, and they don't want to be bothered. Another thing that you can do after you've shaken bees off a branch or really scooped them off of anywhere is to use your smoker to smoke that area to mask the scent that's left in that spot, so that the bees are drawn to the new scent of the box that they're in. And this is because, I'll talk about that in a second, this is because once bees find a home, they'll start to stick their little butts up in the air and fan their wings and release a scent from the Nasanov gland, which signals, here is home, everybody come here. So you don't want to disturb that process too much right away. Once they start fanning, they're letting all those bees in the air that let go as you did the shaking or as you scooped the bees into the box. No, okay, home is this way. It's a scent signal and it brings the bees in. So that's always a good sign. Whew, we're gonna run right out of time. That's all right. This will be recorded, so you can stay with me, or you can go and watch the end of it later. This is the most jerry-rigged swarm catch I've ever done. They literally had to tape their boots, these guys, because they'd never done a swarm catch. The swarm was so high up in a tree branch that we rigged a rake, taped it into a box, climbed up a ladder, precariously stretched all the way out to the very edge of the ladder, and then someone else climbed into the tree house that you can see back here and shook one of the major trunk branches of the tree so that the bees would fall into the box while someone was holding this out like this. It worked. The bees are fine. They're doing great. I would never recommend it. Please be safe. It was the craziest thing I've ever done. The other thing you can do is, after you get the initial swarm, the initial clump of bees into a box, you can hold the box up and you can be the bridge. This takes time. It's a while. You sit with the bees for a while. So there you go. She's inviting the rest of the bees into the box, and they're chaining and bridging their way into the inside. What about a ground swarm? If you find a swarm that's fallen on the ground or is on the ground, like you see here, You can actually just set a hive, if you have one, right next to the swarm. If you don't have one, again, just the box itself. And you can take a handful of those bees and put them into the hive or put them into the box, put the lid back on, and they'll find their way back out and they'll let their sisters know, and the bees will just literally crawl into the box or the hive. This is a top bar hive that I collected from a ground swarm. In the front of the picture on the right, you see the main part of the ground swarm, and then there's some back in the cluster back there that I clipped out. This is a top view of a top bar hive as the swarm is starting to enter it. I then was able to take strands of grass covered in bees and lower the grass strands into the colony bit by bit, leaving both an opening between the bars at the top and at the front of the hive. If you have a top bar hive, you have to end up closing all of the bars eventually. With a Langstroth hive, you're going to have open space at the top until you slide the lid over. So it's nice to leave a little space both at the top and at the entrance for the bees to find their way in before closing up completely. This is an example again of that little bit of space that bees are using both at the top, and then the entrance is near where my hand is. And then the last major method is scooping bees. This is done by taking handfuls of bees, quite literally, and pouring them handful by handful into the box, scooping your bees. You can do it with 2 hands or 1 hand. And if you're nervous, don't start here. It takes time to get to know how to handle the bees and get comfortable with taking handfuls of bees, but it can end up looking like this. You can see below her hands, there's a box that she is lowering the bees into. Bees will stay on your hands, that's okay. You can lightly shake your hands and they'll fall, or go back and collect more bees. Please do this with gloves. This is a very experienced swarm catcher right here. Here's another example. I was doing this in a public place, so I made sure to have gloves on. I actually didn't have any other gear with me, so I just happened to be in a skirt and a shirt and didn't have anything else. I will tell you that in this swarm catch, bees fell on the ground and I just had flip-flops on. They were crawling all over my legs, bare legs. I didn't get stung once. That doesn't mean that won't happen to you. You could easily get stung, but I'm just saying that they are calm. The bees are mostly calm. All I had to do was pull my skirt out and let them fly out the rest of the way. So I know that sounds a little scary, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what was happening there. It's better to have pants on. I just didn't have them with me at that moment, and we were at a restaurant. Again, you see scooping the bees from the tree and then pouring them handful by handful directly into a Langstroth colony. A brief note on tanging. This is another way to work with catching a swarm. Tanging is where you use a metal, in England it would traditionally be called a quoit, but a metal tool or even a drum to bang repeatedly and make a sound when the bees are in mid-flight before they've coalesced on a branch. This sound can draw the bees down to a lower branch or even to the hive that you're trying to get them to arrive at, and they will cluster lower than, they will cluster close to the sound than high up in a branch. If the bees have already coalesced on a branch, it's too late. So this is something that's done mid-swarm. It's a very old folk practice. People often think of it as a folk myth, but I've done it and I know other women who have done it. So it does work. They also will land on you, as you can see in this photo. Great. So for those of you who need to go, it's 1 o'clock. You're welcome to take off. There's a few more steps that we're going to go through about putting the hive into the new home. So we'll go over that. If you need to go, that's okay. This is recorded and it'll be available in a couple of days on YouTube, and you'll get a link so you can watch the remainder of the session. I should just make my swarm 1-hour calls like 4 hours because there's so much to learn about swarming. But nonetheless, here we go, bit by bit, through the process of catching swarms. All right, so let's say you get them all into a box. Let's say you leave that box out until early afternoon. What happens? How do you hive your bees? know there are things missing from what I've shared. I just want to give you an overview of how to catch a swarm. When you're out there in the field, there's going to be questions, how do I do what? But this is the general idea. So that evening, when you hive your bees, when you actually put them into a hive, if you don't catch your bees in a hive itself, as you saw in that picture of me scooping bees and putting them into a Langstroth colony, then you're going to need to hive them, pour them, or introduce them into a hive. And when can you do that? You can do it that evening, like on a warm spring day. You could come back at 5 or 6 and collect the bees, the remaining bees, and then put them in the hive by 8 p.m. as it's getting to be dusk. Putting bees in the hive in the evening is great for the bees because they are less likely to abscond. They're going to stay in the hive overnight and start to build immediately. They'll cluster in a small cluster. So that's one way you can do it. Sometimes though, you aren't able to hive them in the evening and you'll want to hive them the next day. Some people will wait a full 24 hours leaving the bees in that box. If you're going to do that, make sure they have air. Make sure there are holes in the box. If you decide to even leave them overnight, make sure that there are tiny holes in the box. I usually set that up before I even catch the bees, and I use barbecue skewers to create little holes in the box that they can breathe from, just poking holes in the box. And I poke the holes on the sides of the box, not the top, because the top is where they're going to cluster. And that can weaken the box. So I'll do it in the sides. I also tape up any corners because bees will actually chew through cardboard. They'll try to get out of the box once you've sealed it up completely and taped it up completely. By the way, I didn't say that, but if you're transporting these bees in a car, for instance, you're going to want to tape the lid on. You're going to want to tape all the corners up. You're going to want to secure it as much as possible so there's no falling open while you're driving. Be very cautious of that. And if you're extra worried, you can always, if it's a short distance, wrap the bees in a sheet and then unwrap it. You just want to be careful until the bees overheat or suffocate. So if you're going a long distance, please don't do that. Or you could use netting. That's one other way people work with that. But overall, they stay in the box, and you can put them, if you're going to keep them overnight and hive them the next day, you can keep them in a in a cool, dry place. So basements, bathrooms, those are great places to keep your bees overnight. Please don't leave them out in wet grass where it's going to get dewy. What will happen is the cardboard will get wet, they'll chew right through it, and you'll come back and the bees will be either flying or crawling around outside of the box. If they are a really big swarm and this box is too small for them, they might the condensation of their own body heat might start to make the cardboard wet. They might start to chew through the cardboard. So this does happen. If you're really worried about that, you can have your bees in a carport or something like that. If you come out in the morning and there's some bees getting out, some bees flying, that's okay. Just carry the box over to where you're going to hive the swarm. Those few bees coming and going should be okay. And you can set the box up. You can even open it up a little bit right next to where you're going to hive the swarm, and the bees will start to fly a little bit, but not too much. They will need cleansing flights right away. So when you open that box up, when you're ready to actually pour them into the colony, into their new home, sorry, not the colony, the hive. A colony is the bees, the hive is the box. The bees might start, so many bees might start to fly, but not all of them. Most of them will stay in a cluster. So you'll have some bees doing cleansing flights, meaning they're gonna go poo. And then they'll come back to the colony, they'll check out the scene. So you can set that box near where you're going to hive the bees. Try to do it early, or when it's cooler. Don't wait till it's really hot for the bees. That's a surefire way to get some angry bees that might sting you, is if you do it when it's too hot and they've been sort of suffocated for a period of time. Don't do that to the bees. Make sure as well that your hive is ready. If you make sure you have your tools, you have a smoker, your smoker is lit in case something happens and you need to possibly smoke yourself to mask your own scent. That's one of the ways I use my smoker. I really don't use my smoker for bees when it comes to swarms, but as a safety tool for beginner, it's good to have one around. If you're catching a swarm and you see the forecast, it's a small swarm and it's probably going to rain for the next week, they won't have the ability to go out and get food. So that would be a time when you might want to feed your bees. I feed bees honey syrup. If you want to look up a recipe for honey syrup mixed with bee tea, you can look up Spikenard Farms bee tea recipe and Gunther Hawk's work, H-A-C-K, I believe, or H-A-U-C-K. And finally, you're ready to pour, as you see in this photo, literally pour your bees into the hive. So there's a couple of hiving methods. The one that I do the most is pouring. It's not my favorite method, but it's the one that I do the most. And this is literally just pouring bees into the cavity where they're going to live. This is a top bar hive, which is the main hive style I use. As soon as they land in the clump in the bottom of whatever receptacle hive body they're in, they're going to spread out and start climbing up the walls. Many will fly, but they're going to find their way in. So they're currently climbing up the walls and maybe climbing out the entrance. This is a picture of that process. They're climbing up the walls. Remember that bees always climb up. They aren't immediately going to fly. Some will, not always. Again, climbing up, you can see that there's some feed ready in the back of the hive right there for them to access. I'm not using the full space of the hive. In this top bar hive, it's a little bit smaller. They've climbed up the walls. And then carefully and slowly, I will start to put bars back in or frames back in. This is not so much something you have to do with Langstroth colonies. You can just pour the bees over the open bars and they'll just go right down and in. But with top bars, you need to create a space for them to be poured into. And then I always leave a little space left after I've closed up the bars for the remaining bees to find their way. You can see that a lot of these bees have their butts up in the air and they are fanning their wings. You can even see this little white gland that's open on the very ends of their butts. That's the Nasonov gland that's fanning the pheromone saying, this is home, come this way. You might also get bees pouring out the entrance of the hive. That's completely normal. Don't be alarmed. That's what they're doing, orienting, getting used to the space. Closing up the hive takes time. As long as it's generally closed up where the lid is partially over the hive, the bees will start to get the memo that yes, this is a dark new space for us to live in. And then slowly over the course of 20 minutes, half hour, even 40 minutes, you can ease that lid over more and more, close those bars up more and more. And they'll start to cluster. They're crawling up. Why? Why are they always crawling up? Because they're looking for some place to attach and cluster from, to hang from. And from that cluster, they will begin to build comb. So that's what you're giving them, is something to do that from by closing the hive up slowly. Here again, you see them clustering out the front. We're almost done, folks. And then the other method, my favorite method, preferred method, is the ramp method. Basically, you make a wide ramp that leads from the ground up to the entrance of the hive. And instead of pouring the bees into the hive, you pour them onto the ramp. As I've said, bees will always climb up. So they will start to march up the ramp and discover or find the hive on their own. And the exuberance that I feel when I use this method is so genuine. The bees are so happy to discover this home. It's almost like giving them the opportunity to find it themselves, even though you've set it up for them to do so. This is a basic ramp setup. I always use a sheet so that I can see bees and that they can crawl up the sides of the sheet and don't fall on the ground as much. Here's another example of the setup. There's the bees in the shade. I'm getting ready to take them out of the box. It's all taped up. I'm going to pour them onto this ramp. And again, there's another example of the sheet. They'll just crawl right up the ramp into the hive on their own. And this is often a great way to see the queen as she enters into the colony. This is after hiving bees. This is baby Ari 10 years ago. With the bees, they've actually clustered all the way up the front of the colony, which is really common. The front of the hive. And they're going to stay there as they discover their new home. And eventually by the evening, they'll all go in. So that's a normal thing to see, bees amassing up the front of a hive. They would do the same thing on a tree. That brings us to the end. Only 10 minutes past my time. Whew, I did it. That's an overview of how to catch a swarm. Lots of questions, I'm sure, for many of you. You're welcome to email them to me if you have them, or start writing them in here. This is, again, that first heart swarm I caught when I was 29, and with bees for the first time. There's my info if you don't already have it. Beekeeping in Skirts, that's me. Honeybee Wild, that's my site. And I do teach classes. I'm working on an online class that you can take without having to sign up for showing up at a certain time. Just a downloadable online class, but that's taking time. So bear with me while I work towards that. But that will include things like how to set up your bees and how to get started with a colony. I'm going to look at some questions now. So we'll go back to that really beautiful frame. You're welcome, everyone. When combining two secondary swarms, can one put them both directly into one box, or would some type of separation, a newspaper between the boxes, be helpful? If they're two swarms right next to each other and they've both swarmed the same day, you can combine them all at once into the same box. But if you have a small swarm from one colony that you caught, and then you caught another small swarm the following day, you would need to use what's called the newspaper method, or some kind of divider, so that the swarms can slowly combine and get used to each other's scent. Let's see if there's any other questions. Oh, you're very welcome, everyone. Good to have you all. So many wonderful, familiar faces. You're welcome, you're welcome. Okay. With large swarms that need more than one hive. Let me explain that one. I didn't mean that they need more than one hive. I mean, they need more than one box. So the question is, with large swarms that need more than one hive, how do you deal with the issue of queens for each hive? If a swarm is a giant swarm, what I'm talking about is giving them a big enough space. So a top bar hive, for instance, is a one-room swarm space, or one-room hive, and it's smaller. It's meant to be smaller. Wouldn't work so well for a giant swarm. They would just fill up the space and start pouring out the front, and probably abandon that home and go try to find another. When I've had giant swarms, I've either housed them in Waré hives or Langstroth hives. Usually when you're hiving a swarm, you're just going to put them in one box. But the thing about Waré hives and Langstroth hives is that they're multi-box hives. They have multi-rooms. So instead of starting them in one room, I would add two, maybe even three. Like with a Waré hive and that giant swarm I found, I would probably start with 3 boxes instead of 1, or instead of 2, 3 boxes, and pour them all into that column of boxes as their hive. So I'm just starting with more boxes. Not possible in a one-room hive like the sun hive or the golden mean hive, et cetera, but definitely doable in a larger cavity. So you're just creating a larger cavity for them. Question, how do you know swarm you hived on birthday was for someone else? Oh, that's a really, really great question. So the way I work with bees, I'm going back to a picture of a swarm there for you. The way I work with bees is both intuitive and you could call it energetic. And the best way I could say it is a gut feeling or a knowing. I got the call, I met the swarm, and I just knew that they were supposed to go to this friend's property and not come with me. I felt it. It was a yes inside. And we all have those yeses and nos. And I use that internal yes and no constantly in beekeeping. Should I go in the hive in this moment? Drop into my breath. I often close my eyes. I feel into my body. For me, I work with my womb, but you can also work with your solar plexus or your heart. Feel into that place. Imagine yourself there and just ask for a yes or a no. And you'll often get one, way more often than we think. It's a great thing to practice with mundane things like, should I go to that party or not? Well, now not, because nobody can party because we're in quarantine. But instead of thinking about it, just does my body have a yes or a no? That's the same mechanism, that same energy that said, turn down this road. I just feel like it. I feel like I should walk down this road. And then there's my swarm. So that answers that to a degree, but it's really about being in your body and connecting to that intuitive sense that your animal instincts, your intuitive animal, because you're an animal, is also feeling into the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, queendom, whatever you want to call it, and being receptive to the other senses that we have. I'm going to just go back up to some more questions. Okay, how would you combine two swarms in a top bar hive? I typically wouldn't combine two swarms in a top bar hive. A small swarm is usually fine in a top bar hive. But if I did have two really small swarms, this is Adrian asking, you can actually kind of jerry rig a newspaper partition with tape into your hive, and the bees will chew through it, and then you'll have to go in there and pull that stuff out. But that's I've done that before. You can also you can use a follower board that has some siding that the bees can get through, and put the bees on either side of the colony as long as there are two entrances. You might have to drill a second entrance in the back of the colony. But usually, I don't usually combine swarms. It's very rare unless I'm doing it in the moment, as in two small clusters that I'm just bringing together to make a larger cluster. And it seems very clear that that's what they are. That's another place I check in. Do you want to be combined? Are you two separate full beings coming into form, or is it okay to bring you together? And sometimes I'll get a yes, and sometimes I'll get a no. You're welcome, all of you asking. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for all your wonderful comments, everyone. Did the flow hive system become something good for bees? What are my thoughts? Longer topic, different topic, but I think it brought a lot of awareness around bees, and I think ultimately their idea of not going into a hive as much is great. I know that they worked with bee thinking folks who are kind of transitioned over to Bee Built, a great company, and that they convinced them to go foundationless, which is a really great way to keep bees, and have them build their own natural comb. So that was one of the best parts about the flow hive. But I personally do not like plastic in my hive. And I don't like the idea of having an open run of honey seeping out of the hive because of the amount of stress it would put on the bees. So no, I don't think the flow hive is that great for bees, but I have seen people have a lot of success with it. It's just not my personal style. I tend to focus on keeping plastic out of the hive. Oh, you're welcome, you're welcome. Let's see, Sadie. If you get called to catch a swarm and then find out if it's actually a newly established colony, not a swarm, what can you do? Is this a whole big other process? At that point, Sadie, it becomes a bee removal process. And there are people and companies that do that. I have folks, Hillary Kearney has some great examples of that, Girl Next Door Honey. Swarm and Tender is a company here in California, and they do bee removals. Sometimes they'll vacuum the bees out of the space. Sometimes if they're a well-established colony, you have to go in, take off the wall, and take pieces of comb and attach them, wire them, rubber band them, tie them into a Langstroth box usually, because that's the only way to do it, into those frames generally, and have the colony move into that new box. So that's a whole different thing. Basically, if you get a call like that, don't take it. You can't catch that swarm because they've already established themselves as a colony inside a new location. I'll finish with one last story about connecting with bees, and then we'll be done for today. The first time my bees swarmed, I was outside, and they started to billow out of the colony, out of the hive, and they went really high up, and they went to my neighbor's house. And at that time, I was living with neighbors who would very, very, very much like to not ever have bees near them, and would destroy the colony. So They went over into the top high roof of my neighbor's house and they were straight into a hollow there. And off they went, deeper and deeper into the roofing of the house. And I dropped deeply into meditation and started to meditate with the bees and give them the message that they're not safe there, because they weren't. And asked them to come to a low branch and that I would give them a home. And I just kept asking them to change their course and connecting with them and feeling them and sending them love and telling them that I could give them a better home. And then all of a sudden they came pouring out of that place that they had chosen and flew right down to a butterfly bush, so low to the ground that I could just put a hive underneath them and they crawled right into it. I didn't even have to catch them. They were just drooped in a beautiful heart shape. So there's something that happens when we allow ourselves to connect in with the idea that this is a being, that this being is becoming something, and that we can communicate with it even though we don't have language, even though they don't have readable faces the way a dog or a cat does, that there is a sentient intelligence present in that moment, made up of thousands and thousands of little beings coming into one being, and that we can use our senses to connect with the more than human world, to drop in and to invite something that is more like kinship to occur between us. And with that, I am complete. Thank you so much for staying a little over, and I will send you all the recording of this talk. Be well and good luck with finding swarms. I'll see you later.